thing. It just feels like home, which is the whole point, I think, of the work, is that too often people overlook how important it is for you to feel safe before you do any kind of healing work. And depending on what you've been through and how you were born to be, that pacing may look very different for you. So, like you said, if you need to leave, if you need to walk away from this, if you need to listen to it later, if you're not ready for like a year to listen to some of this, that's fine. But too many outlets are assuming that we're all starting from the same place. And we just aren't. Some of us are survivors of trauma ourselves. Some of us are descendants of trauma survivors. And it looks different on every individual body what those experiences mean for us. So it's really important, if you're trying to create a brave space or a safer space, that you give people room to be themselves and experience life the way they experience it, instead of projecting onto them how we think they should feel, because that's always coming through our own bias lens. And you don't know. Even with siblings, you probably see it all the time, that you have a lot of shared experiences, and how they remember it, how you remember it's completely different, and the effect it had on them and on you, completely different. And they're not wrong and you're not wrong. You're just different. So that's one of the things I really wanted to address in the book. I am a registered dietitian, but most people know the field is ridiculously fat phobic, white supremacist, sex. It's a lot of things. And even people who mean well, have not been trained to give people room to be themselves. And they haven't been trained to understand that there is nothing wrong with falling outside of what they have been told is normal, that diversity is part of being human. And we don't need to encourage people to work against their nature, because their nature is fine. I think I might have forgotten to introduce myself in there. I did say I'm a registered dietitian. My name is Dalia.
Well, thanks for introducing yourself and running through that. Do we kind of want to set it up a question answer? Would that work? I personally have a couple questions. And then I'm sure Laura does. They are much more eloquent with words than I am.
That sounds perfect. Let's do that.
Yeah. And then
and anyone here who wants to like raise your hands or send us a message saying, I have a question, or if you just want to try the luck of the draw and unmute yourself and then do the awkward back and forth when someone else unmutes themselves, that dance is okay too.
So my first question is, this is not question, maybe an observation that leads to a question. This is the first time I've encountered a book, especially on the subject of decolonizing, anything, especially in the wellness world, mental health, that literally says from the beginning that this is for queer, trans, Black, brown, Indigenous people of color. Like, it lays it like literally on the cover. Like, this is who I wrote this book for. If you're reading it, cool. But here's who's centered in this. And that was really awesome. I think sometimes that isn't obvious and isn't said, and I love that. I just wanted to say that first of all. And I kind of wanted to ask how you got to a place where not just centering people of color, but queer and trans community. Like, that is a whole different ball game, because the like intersections and layers of marginalized identities is just like phyllo dough layer. And nice, as fragile, reference. I know we watch a lot of baking show. So just kind of wondering how you got to that space, because it's rare. You don't see it that often.
It took so much time. I feel like this is always what I wanted to do, but didn't feel like I had permission. And through my life, like in hindsight, I can look back and see all the times where I was disciplined or ridiculed or maybe laughed at for trying to center anything outside of cis white hetness. And so that training sometimes it's positive reinforcement for being told, oh, you're doing such a good job of assimilating, or I understand that you're fighting these urges, but good for you for not leading with them or letting everybody know. And then there's also just outright attacks when you decide to just be yourself and be drawn to who you're drawn to. This is who I'm most comfortable with, even though I have a lot of straight people in my life that I love, a lot of cis people in my life that I love. When I'm hanging out with them, there's always work to be done. So I always have to be ready to be misgendered and be ready for no one to notice. Of course, we get misgendered in queer spaces, but someone will notice and you probably won't have to say anything. One of your friends is going to catch it, or somebody you just met is going to catch it. But in a straight space by yourself, you have to decide, okay, everybody else has moved on. They're having a good time. They didn't hear it. I'm still stuck back here. What am I going to do? And that is a drain on you. And I just kept feeling like it wasn't worth it for me to keep making what I was called to do smaller or playing down what I really wanted to do so that I could feel more safe when I know that there's so many other people out there having the same experience as me and more difficult, that need to hear that, hey, this is happening to all of us. And there's nothing wrong with your reaction. People just don't talk about how hard it is to be yourself in a world that's decided only certain types of humans are okay. And there's nothing that you've done wrong. And you're not wrong for getting stuck on it. Because that was one of the recurring messages that I was getting when I first started trying to seek out help for high levels of anxiety and what was, I don't know if you would call it mild depression, but what I was still out and about and functioning, but just felt like I had a weight on my back at all time, that type of feeling of depression. And went to multiple therapists, multiple counselors, and some people would basically say, well, if you know it's not true, why do you let it bother you? And that is frequently what you're told, that somehow if things are unfair, the onus is on you to get over it because the only thing you can control is yourself. And while in the end, the only thing we can control is ourselves, that absolutely doesn't mean that it isn't normal, natural, and valid for you to be righteously indignant about all of the injustices in the world that affect you and affect the people you love and affect perfect strangers, because some of us are actually compassionate human beings and we don't only get upset when things are happening to us. We know that isn't how all humans react to the world, but some of us are really weighed down by all the things that are wrong in the world. And people may tell you to just ignore it, but you literally cannot, because that is not how you are made. So, what can you do to sit with the reality of all that is awful and experience your life and do the things you're here to do and enjoy yourself? Like, just because we have marginalized identities doesn't mean we're supposed to be out here suffering every day. But even that phrasing, I struggled with what words to use to refer to people that the rest of the world is giving shit, because marginalized, even like, it almost sounds like it's still about us. Like there's something wrong with us when we are not the ones doing anything wrong. But there was like no language that was less than a paragraph to explain, to really say that. But that even tells you how controlled the narrative has been by people who refuse to let people be themselves, because there are things that just don't exist in English and in a lot of colonizer languages that would allow us to identify ourselves, even like the fact that there are other languages where there are gender neutral pronouns, and there always have been. And it's only such a big deal in English and in English speaking countries because language to a large extent affects the way you see the world. But who chose to speak English in this Zoom? Like none of us got to make that decision. The fact that the language is not compatible with our identity at this moment doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. That means there's limitations in the language and it's time to grow and expand. And other languages have already done this. So I wanted to create something that addressed the fact that even seeing our world through the lenses that we didn't choose but we were born with can be damaging, because you might really start to believe that somehow you are different and you are the problem, when if you really back up and look at the world as a whole, you see that we have always been here and there's nothing strange about being attracted to somebody regardless of their genitals. And there's nothing strange about maybe only being attracted to one type of person. There's nothing strange about being asexual. Like, this diversity has always been us.
Thank you. I'll do a question here, and then after this, if there's a little longer silence, I'm comfortable with silence to give some of the other people here a chance to type or unmute themselves. But something that Christine and I both talked about, speaking of language, is your choice to write about mindful eating rather than, people here might have heard of intuitive eating, or different phrases for that. I've had many thoughts through the years about the shortcomings of intuitive eating, particularly around class, around a lack of understanding of how eating disorders function, how gender dysphoria functions, how neurodivergence functions, how all of these things, how someone may not have access to the ingredients of the foods that they are craving for a variety of reasons. And so I was really struck by your very intentional choice to talk about mindful eating and framing it that way, but in a very expansively defined way, where that has space for all of the different motivations for nourishing ourselves. And I would like to hear more about your process of figuring out how you talk about food in a way that makes space for and celebrates fatness, queerness, Blackness, without reducing that.
Mm. Yeah, when I was looking, this was years ago, at intuitive eating as an alternative to restrictive dieting, even though the effort is there, it's still got fat phobia like a centimeter below the surface. And even though they say, well, don't hope to lose weight, because that's not how this works, then they immediately shift towards all these things that basically continue to support the dysfunctional thinking that lands us in this like really antagonistic relationship with food. I liked the idea of just bringing awareness to what we're doing, because there's no obligation to change. And what if what we're doing has a purpose? Because generally, every coping mechanism that we use, it serves a purpose. And you might find that if you I've had this happen to a lot of clients, and I've had this experience where my weight changed and I felt like something that was being managed by my weight suddenly was out of control and needed active maintenance. Like, if I wanted to keep people from constantly approaching me, that the more I could present as masculine and maybe a little larger, at least I felt larger. I'm kind of short, so it's all relative. But I find that I got less attention that I did not want. And I had to put a whole lot less energy into creating and maintaining boundaries. But then if my weight would change and I looked like I took up less space, I felt more vulnerable, like out in the world in general. So just thinking about, when am I full? When am I satisfied? That wasn't going to address what the weight was doing for me. And it wasn't addressing like what was really behind continuing to eat as much as I possibly had room for, because I did not want to be any smaller. And that was mostly a subconscious thing. But because people are so determined to elevate thinness above all other things, if you go to someone and you say anything that kind of sounds like, but I think I want to be this size. They're just going to give you a laundry list of things that they think will happen to you. Like your head will explode, your eyeballs will pop out if your BMI is over 30. You know how people get really melodramatic and focus on all of these things instead of looking at the whole person and understanding that food serves a different purpose for all of us at different times in our lives, at different points in the day. And that is all fine. And I also find constantly in public health in particular, people tend to demonize fatness in communities of color even more so, because whether it's conscious or subconscious, they've linked it to like, oh, poor impulse control or not being able to assimilate from a dietary perspective enough. And when people tell you what are healthy foods and unhealthy foods, even in that intuitive eating framework, it's super, super white North American. Like, what is a healthy food? And there's like a world of food beyond that, like indigenous foods that have nourished people for millennia that are not taken into consideration. And then some people will move away from these foods thinking, well, this must be better because this is all they listed, not understanding that, well, their racism came to the book writing or to the writing of this list. Nothing against those individual authors personally, but people keep acting as though if there's even a sprinkle of science there, that means all the bias is gone. And that just isn't how it works. And I really wanted to direct people's attention back to themselves as the authority on their lives and their body, because you are the utmost authority on your life and your body. And the only obstacle that people generally need to work through is releasing that need to get permission. And that isn't something that we have because we're defective. It's something that we have because it was beaten into us that we need permission for everything and that there's a right way to do everything. And so we look outside of ourselves for a framework, even for how to take care of ourselves, even for how to express our gender, even for how to express our sexuality. Because I know even for me, I remember telling someone who a self-proclaimed gold star person said that they were open to dating people who, were not exclusively only with other cis women, but that some things have been different. And they didn't specify what that was. So immediately my head went to like, oh, we're not queer enough. Like there's something we don't know. There's some secret knowledge you get from spending lots of time with vaginas. Like if you parse your time out at all with anything else, like you're going to fall behind. And that is so limited. And that's me thinking, once again, there's one right way to be, and there's one right way to do everything. And so this person probably knows how to pleasure a cis woman more than I do because, they are official, because they only have sex with other women. But that is what happens when your entire life, especially coming through public school. I hear sometimes in private school it's a little different because sometimes they seem to want to raise critical thinkers and independent thinkers. But in public school, you're raised to follow the rules and to look for the structure and just follow instructions. Like they don't really want you out here creating your own solutions. And creativity is oftentimes judged harshly as though it's objective what's right and wrong, when in hindsight as an adult you can see a lot of these assignments were totally subjective, and like the teachers who told you you couldn't write worth the shit or something you did wasn't good enough, that was their opinion and it doesn't really matter. And they had the option of saying, you know what, that's not my thing, but maybe I should just empower this little person to keep following their natural gifts and the things that call their attention. But because that's not how it goes, we're really at a disadvantage in all areas of our life because we have so much trouble trusting ourselves because we've been told that we can't trust ourselves. I see Susan.
Hi, I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit more about sort of the judgment lobbed against poor impulse control, right? And what you were just saying about being able to trust oneself. Could you just sort of expand upon those two ideas in connection, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I have found this language is all over the place, especially in the South, about needing to basically be aware of your impulses, like of the flesh, right? Or basically, don't trust your intuition, don't trust your gut, don't trust your body, don't trust your sex drive, don't trust your appetite. And you can hear it in language that people use all over the country around food, also, that they'll even demonize the food or give the food evil qualities, like, oh, it's sinfully delicious, as though this food, though inanimate, is trying to seduce you, and your carnal nature can't be trusted around this shady, tempting food. When in reality, throughout nature, pleasure is a positive cue. And we don't have to worry about so many things because you get positive feedback from your body. So you continue to do it. And demonizing pleasure in certain areas doesn't make any sense, because the same way it makes sense to hold a baby and caress a baby, they don't know why they want to be held, they don't know what it's doing for them, it just gives them a positive sensation. Why would you think that's okay? You hold a baby because it feels nice, it feels comforting, but don't eat certain types of food that give you pleasure, because in that instance, pleasure is dangerous. In reality, pleasure is generally a very good guide of what serves you. But when you eat food in a way that's really detached from sensation, you will think maybe you're eating because of pleasure, but you're eating because of something else. Because if you're really tapped in, you may find that what you think you like and what you're constantly drawn toward is not the same thing. So I always am drawn toward desserts because they're like the most beautiful food. For some reason, everybody makes desserts really pretty, but I get super nauseous after like my second helping of almost every kind of dessert. But what I really am wanting when I choose a dessert is usually decadence or something opulent, or to just feel a little bit of luxury in my day. But in reality, my body doesn't enjoy the sugar. So I have to be tapped into what's really giving me pleasure to know the difference between what my eye thinks looks appealing and what my body says is really pleasurable. And when it comes to the poor impulse control being even seen as a negative, I think that comes from our puritanical roots in this country, that you're always supposed to be controlling the body, taming the body, control and tame nature, control and tame everything, beat yourself into submission. Like, people literally use this language sometimes still about beating themselves into submission. And it is just a cultural thing that we came up with here. And a lot of times the popular religion of the countries in which we're born, they don't have to be our own to influence the way we see the world. So even non-religious people here in the United States, we still pick up on that because it's throughout the literature that we were told we had to read as kids. Think of how much of the socialization really is standardized, like how much of mandatory reading is the same from one coast to the other coast. It is amazing what an influence culture outside the home can have on you, even if your household is non-religious and is all about embracing the body and is sex positive. It is amazing what just going outside does to your brain. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think a lot about, even in mental health spaces, this invitation to be very skillful at self-regulation. That's similar. I mean, it's the phraseology is different, but it gets at the same thing. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that talk about what it is to be mindfully eating. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. checking the comments.
I was just very quickly thinking about a connection between this idea of mindfulness and something, Dalia, you referred to earlier about bearing witness to someone misgendering you, or in any other way, speaking in a way that is harmful or violent to the truth of oneself, and how that hooks you and kind of keeps you in that moment a bit, and how that operates as a barrier to being present for the rest of that conversation in the most valid of ways, but how to a certain degree, these not to a pretty profound degree, these acts of oppression preemptively get in the way of our ability to be mindful and to be in pleasure.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that, because I know that's a big struggle for me. And I think anybody who is like an elder millennial or younger, we have it kind of times 10, that resistance to being present with uncomfortable feelings, because we've had so many distractions made available for us. So we've had so many different ways to opt out of being present. I mean, it's never easy for people to be present. I mean, that's why it's their entire belief systems built around that practice. But you have to learn to be able to sit with discomfort in order to be able to fully experience pleasure. But there's so many layers to this, because in addition to there being a ton of distractions out there that help us feel regulated in the moment, but in the long term reduce our pleasure overall, also, like you say, oppression continues to pull us out of the present. So we really have an opportunity here. It's not a requirement by any means, but it's an opportunity to really dive deep into prioritizing our own needs in a way that we may not even see other people do that have celebrated identities. Because that, from my perspective, is literally the only way we'll get to experience like the maximum amount of joy and pleasure in this life, is if we really go all in on what is it going to take for me to feel safe most of the time, and what can I do when I have to be in spaces where I don't feel safe, and how can I work with things that I can't control, that are not fair, that I know are weighing on me. What can I give up to make more room for that? So like if you have a job that you detest, but you know that in your small town, you don't have a lot of options, then what are you going to do with the rest of the hours in your week that will support you through that? Because sometimes that's the reality. Sometimes you hear people criticizing other people for not taking more control over their life. But what if they perceive a danger that you can't perceive because they're having a different experience from you? Because I've heard from so many trans friends that are way more qualified in their fields than I am, that they dare not change companies now that they are transitioning, or that they dare not change companies in this environment where jobs are not protected based on gender identity. And if you don't create a space where the people around you feel safe enough to explain, but here's what you're not seeing, then what does that feel like for that person to keep having everyone tell them, like, you just don't get that you have the freedom to take control of your life? Maybe they are taking control of their lives by eating that shit sandwich every Monday and going into that place that they hate, because they know that's what it's going to take for them to feel safe enough to get through life. Having a roof over your head really affects your sense of safety. Knowing that you can pay your bills really affects your sense of safety. What is it going to take for you to secure those things? We don't all have the same choices.
I just want to draw your attention. Denise sent a question into the chat. that Denise has not read the book, can you offer a synopsis of its hopeful takeaways for the reader?
Okay. I I struggle with conciseness, but I would say my takeaways that I really hope everybody gets is that you can be trusted, your intuition can be trusted, your body can be trusted. The fact that you exist indicates that you come from a long line of people whose bodies were capable of survival. And that's literally why you're here. You're not defective. And darn near everything your body does that maybe is seen as defective or even a disease state, it is a response to the environments that you are in or that the people who came before you were in. And your body is trying to work with you at all times. And even when you're angry at your body for letting you down in some way, or not doing all the things you want it to do, or not having the shape that you want it to have, it's still trying to work with you. It's always with you. And that whatever you think you need to do to be happier in the body you're right. I'm not even going to say you're probably right. You're right. If it keeps coming up for you, like I just can't I can't take another day of not having my top surgery. You're right. Now, whether or not you have access to the resources that you need to get the things done that you need to have done, that's another story. But you are right, is basically the whole summary of the book, is that you know what you're talking about and you don't need permission to exist and you don't need to justify your existence. And there's a whole lot of obstacles in between you knowing that up here and really feeling that throughout your body. And it's because of basically every person you interacted with as a child influenced your way of seeing what's right and what's wrong about yourself and about your body. But the research supports that you know what you're doing, and intuitively, you know, your body is always trying to guide you back to where you were meant to be all along. You're welcome. Oh, since you don't save the notes, I want to say that I was responding to to a comment instead of just saying something, that being like, you're welcome.
If anyone really has a burning desire for a question that you aren't sure to ask, we have Dalia's presence till 6:45. I strongly recommend taking this opportunity to share your question.
So I see a question from Jennifer. How did you arrive at the conclusion that we are the best expert on our own bodies? Who or what influenced me? I would say part of this is probably upbringing. And so I'm half Black American, half Afro-Cuban and Jamaican. And my grandma, the Cuban grandma, is, well, she has dementia now, but I think she probably would still say this. She's always believed that you get more information from your body than anything else. And she always stressed that the most stressful thing for her about being a parent of babies that were not talking yet was that she couldn't get that information out of them. So then you have to like watch them like a hawk for physical cues of, again, their body telling you what's wrong. And just listening to her regale us with stories of how they used body wisdom to handle not acute things, like not like a broken arm or something, like they would still go to the doctor for that, but for lots of chronic conditions when they were living far away from hospitals, when they were living without access to healthcare. And the fact that she's even 98 right now, and she would not be happy about the dementia, but everything else made it like her body's doing fine. And to know that she did almost all of that on intuition alone, and that there were many times where she fought to get a diagnosis for herself or a child. Because if I think it's rough now going to the doctor, I cannot imagine what it was like for her in the 60s and the 50s, just how people were not listening to any femme presenting people about literally anything. And then also being a person of color on top of that. And then also having a non-English native speaker accent on top of that, just constantly being told, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. And in addition to that, working in public health, I can think of so many examples. One of my favorite ones is of a mom who kept coming in. We would see kids from birth until 5 years old. So, man, those kids make you feel so old when you knew them before they came out of the womb. And then they're like walking around your office talking smack. But I get to see parents who were first time parents. And every time they went to the physician with a concern based on their baby's body language, they were told, you don't really know your new parent, babies get colicky, they probably have gas, blah, 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 blah. Oh, they're constipated. Well, you should have breastfed. It's always the parent's fault, right? Oh, you fed them the wrong thing, blah, blah, blah. It's your fault. It's your fault. It'll be fine. See you later. And there have been multiple instances where the parent had to go to like over 6, maybe over 10 physicians for someone to actually do screening work where they could physically see the problem, instead of the physician just going based on their gut, instead of listening to the person who's with this other little human all day long, reading their body language. And then they see like, oh, this is an extremely rare condition, but your child literally has like an inverted rectum and they are never going to be able to poop without a ton of laxatives, but we can't operate until they're at least 3. Well, all that time, everybody told this parent they were wrong. I never heard of that health condition before. It's just an anatomical issue. It's just to be told that nothing's wrong simply because the problem is not familiar to the person. Like that is the experience every time you go to the physician. If you have any kind of chronic illness that isn't super well known. And I had to work through that as well. I have Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune condition, which basically attacks your thyroid and causes all kinds of metabolic problems. And that's why I have one kind of weird eye. It just does a bunch of stuff to your body, but it took years to be diagnosed. And I was told a million different ways, it's probably something you're doing, from like, oh, it's because you got too fat. Okay, well, I've been fat before. I never felt like I was having hot flashes. I would explain, I understand that you think it's this, but I'm telling you that part didn't change. And these are new symptoms. And people still would not listen. And when I was finally diagnosed, and I went home to read up on like, what is Graves' disease? Never heard of this. I had like 15 out of the 16 symptoms that came up on the first page of Google. So I knew, and I just needed somebody to listen to me because I was literally giving them all the hints they needed to diagnose me. And you just hear this again and again and again if you work healthcare adjacent, even. Um, it's just amazing how much people refuse to accept that people know their body.
So, Delia, I want to balance honoring your time with the fact that there was also another really good question that came into the chat, and I want to give you the opportunity to consent or withdraw consent
Oh, I'm on
for
it.
more time.
I consent. I consent. So Brittany says, love your podcast. Thank you for listening. Sometimes, sometimes podcasters feel like nobody's listening. What are some of the biggest ways you see colonization or white supremacy showing up in wellness? What are some of the ways you help clients reconnect with trust? Well, with trusting themselves or reconnect with themselves again. I think some of the biggest ways is in the imagery that's always put forth as like, this is a healthy body. It's always an able-bodied person. It's almost always, they don't even let the curly haired white people get any play. It's usually always a straight haired white person. And also in the specific food recommendations that people make, instead of just saying something more general, like just saying something about like leafy greens would allow somebody to pick callaloo or collard greens or kale, but some people will just give you a list of what they call superfoods and it will limit you to kale, and you're thinking, is that a whole lot better than callaloo? I've never seen a callaloo listed anywhere as like a green you should eat, but of course if you just look at it, you know it's not that different. But that's the limited way in which in a lot of wellness spaces, people just let their own culture inform how they write nutrition education materials. And they don't think about ways to make room for other people to put in the foods that would be relevant to them. And some of the ways that I try and work with clients is to ask them to look for evidence in their own lives. It doesn't have to be their personal life. It could be something they observed as a child and a grandparent or a parent who was thriving and they did it on their own terms without assimilating, so that they could see that there's multiple ways to do almost everything. And something really interesting that a white American friend mentioned to me recently that she's exploring is reconnecting with the indigenous cultural ways that she was torn apart from when, you know, her ancestors came to the United States and everybody was like, we're just white now, when everybody was coming from very unique cultural groups. And a lot of people have just completely forgotten all of the old ways. So she's been exploring like what foods were indigenous to the parts of Ireland that her grandparents came from, and what maybe she's missing out on that she doesn't even know she's missing. And I think that can be really helpful. Like if there's any way you can connect with relatives that still know relatives that live in the countries that your ancestors came from, that can be really nice to see what does health look like through a more specific to my family history lens, and to just look for evidence because it's all around you of people living life on their own terms and physically thriving. Like there really aren't as many rules as we think there are about how to be happy and well in a human body.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Sweetie, how are you notifying the people who won the book, since there are some people who weren't able to show up live? Do you want to do a quick?
I have everybody's email.
Okay.
That's why we had everybody register. And when I send out, I'm going to send out the recording to everybody that registered, even if you are here. And at that point, I will notify and include Dalia's personal information, their news, or Dalia's newsletter and Dalia's Substack. Yeah. Does that sound reasonable? And then anything else Dalia would like me to include?
That sounds perfect. And then that'll be super easy for us to get the books out to everybody. Oh, never mind. You have the books already.
I do have them.
That's
Yes. Your publisher sent them right on over.
Perfect. This has been such a pleasure. Yeah, it's just been amazing to see how much support has shown up for the book and how many allies really are walking the walk. And I had so much fear about coming right out and saying a lot of these things clearly. And it's been such a joy to see that there's so much more support than I ever could have imagined. I'm out here in the sticks, y'all.
We are very, very grateful for your time with all of us. We were also very excited about tonight. So
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
doing the
everybody.
work. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all so much. And thank you for taking your time and energy and attention. We feel it and are appreciative.
We're going to go ahead and log off. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.